Long before the Imperium became a realm of endless war, before the stars burned with betrayal and brother turned against brother, there was a moment of fragile calm. A moment when humanity stood on the edge of something impossibly vast and almost beautiful. This is not a story that rushes forward with the clash of blades or the roar of cannons. It is a slow, measured descent. A tragedy that unfolds so gently at first that many never realized they were already falling. The Horus Heresy was not born in a single act of rebellion. It did not erupt suddenly like a storm. Instead, it crept forward, patient and deliberate, shaped by silence as much as by violence. It was forged in conversations left unfinished, in expectations never spoken aloud, and in the quiet distance between a father and his sons. To understand it fully, you must first let go of the idea that heroes always know when they are becoming villains. In the distant past, humanity was broken. Terra, once called Earth, was a scarred world of warring empires, shattered technologies, and forgotten dreams. The age of strife had left mankind isolated and afraid, scattered among the stars, prey to alien empires and the horrors of the warp. Knowledge had become myth. Progress had become heresy. Survival, nothing more than a daily struggle against extinction. It was in this darkness that the Emperor of mankind revealed himself. He did not arrive as a god, though many would later worship him as one. He came as a ruler, a conqueror, and a visionary. With unmatched intellect and power, he unified Terra through fire and reason, breaking tyrants and false gods alike. His message was simple, almost soothing in its certainty. Humanity would no longer kneel to superstition or fear. There would be no gods. No masters beyond human will. Only unity, logic, and the promise of a future written by mankind alone. From this vision, the Imperium of man was born. Yet even in its earliest days, there was a contradiction at its heart. The Emperor demanded absolute obedience, but offered little explanation. He promised enlightenment, but ruled through conquest. And while he spoke of humanity's destiny, he kept his own true nature distant and unknowable. Those who followed him believed this distance was necessary. That such a vast plan required secrets. Few considered what that silence might one day cost. To reclaim the stars, the Emperor needed generals unlike any humanity had ever known. And so he created the Primarchs, 20 sons, each engineered to embody an aspect of his will. They were not merely commanders, they were legends made flesh. Stronger, faster, and more brilliant than any human, they were designed to lead armies and shape civilizations. They were meant to be more than sons. They were meant to be instruments of destiny. But destiny intervened. Before they could be raised at his side, the Primarchs were scattered across the galaxy by forces unseen. Cast onto distant worlds, each grew in isolation, shaped by alien cultures, brutal environments, and personal suffering. When the Emperor finally found them again, one by one, he welcomed them back not with explanations but with purpose. Each reunion was marked by triumph, yet something fundamental had already been lost. They were his sons, but they were also strangers. Among them, one stood above all others. Horus Lupercal was the first Primarch the Emperor rediscovered, and in many ways, the most beloved. Where others were proud or aloof, Horus was warm. Where others inspired fear, Horus inspired loyalty. He was charismatic, thoughtful, and deeply human in a way few of his brothers ever managed to be. Soldiers followed him not out of duty alone, but because they wanted to. He listened. He remembered names. He shared victories and bore defeats. Alongside his warriors. To Horus, the Emperor was not merely a distant creator. He was a father. And for a time, Horus believed, truly believed, that he understood his father's grand design. As the Great Crusade surged across the galaxy, reclaiming lost human worlds and crushing alien empires, Horus became its brightest symbol. World after world fell into compliance. The Imperium expanded at a pace that seemed unstoppable. Humanity stood united beneath a single banner for the first time in millennia. It was an age of conquest, yes, but also an age of hope. Many believed they were witnessing the beginning of a golden era that would last forever. But golden ages rarely announce their ending. The emperor, consumed by plans known only to himself, eventually withdrew from the front lines of the crusade. He returned to Terra, leaving Horus in command of the Imperium's vast armies. The title of Warmaster was bestowed upon him, a mark of absolute trust. To the galaxy, it seemed only natural. If anyone could carry the Emperor's will forward, it was Horus. Yet command brings with it a weight that admiration cannot ease. Horus now bore responsibility not only for victory, but for every failure. Every world that resisted, every brother who questioned orders, every life lost in the name of compliance. The Emperor's absence grew heavier with each passing year, and his silence louder than any decree. Questions went unanswered, doubts went unaddressed, and in that quiet space between father and son, something dangerous began to grow. Resentment does not always arrive as anger. Sometimes, it comes as loneliness. Around Horus, others watched and waited. Some felt overlooked. Some felt humiliated. Some believed the Imperium had strayed from its supposed ideals. Faith, once outlawed, began to whisper in the shadows. Not the faith of old gods, but something darker. Something patient. Something that promised truth in exchange for trust. And so, while the Imperium marched ever forward, convinced of its own righteousness, the foundations beneath it began to crack. The Horus Heresy did not begin with treachery. It began with belief, with love, with the quiet certainty that one was doing the right thing, even when the path forward no longer felt clear. And as this story unfolds, slowly and inevitably, remember this: by the time the galaxy realized it was at war with itself, it was already far too late. For now, rest in this moment before the fall. The stars are still whole. Brothers still fight side by side. And hope, though fragile, has not yet been extinguished. Before betrayal had a name, before the word heresy carried the weight of 1,000,000 deaths, the Imperium of man was expanding with breathtaking confidence. To those living within it, this was not an age of fear, but an age of certainty. Humanity had survived its darkest era and emerged unified, powerful, and seemingly unstoppable. The stars no longer felt hostile. They felt destined. And if you stay with this story until the very end, you will gain something rare, a complete, uninterrupted understanding of how hope itself became the Imperium's greatest weakness, and why the galaxy has never truly slept since. The Great Crusade was not simply a war of conquest. It was a reclamation. World after world was brought back into the fold of humanity, some willingly, others by force. Lost colonies, isolated for thousands of years, looked to the sky and saw ships bearing the Eagle of Terra. To many, these fleets were salvation. To others, they were an omen. Compliance was demanded, not negotiated. There was no room for refusal, because refusal meant extinction. At the heart of this crusade marched the Legiones Astartes, the Space Marines. Transhuman warriors engineered to know no fear, no hesitation, and no mercy. They were living symbols of the Imperium's authority, each legion reflecting the character of its Primarch. Where they went, resistance ended. Where they stood, history was rewritten. Above them all stood the Primarchs themselves, beings of impossible presence, revered as demigods by mortal soldiers. Each was brilliant in war, but deeply flawed in spirit. Pride, wrath, ambition, idealism, these traits were not mistakes. They were intentional. The Emperor believed that humanity's future would require rulers who understood both creation and destruction. What he did not account for was how deeply those traits would shape his sons when left to grow without his guidance. As the crusade advanced, cracks began to show, subtle at first, almost invisible. Some worlds questioned why compliance meant cultural erasure. Others wondered why the Imperium rejected faith while demanding devotion. The Emperor's truth claimed there were no gods, yet his sons were worshipped wherever they went. The contradiction lingered, unresolved, quietly gnawing at those who noticed it. And Horus noticed everything. As Warmaster, Horus carried not only command, but expectation. Every triumph reinforced the belief that the Imperium could not be challenged. Every victory convinced its leaders that they were morally right simply because they were powerful. Horus, more than any of his brothers, understood the cost of this certainty. He listened to governors who feared compliance. He heard the doubts of his captains. He felt the unease spreading through the ranks, a sense that the Imperium was beginning to resemble the tyrannies it claimed to have destroyed. Yet he pushed forward, because to question the Crusade was to question the Emperor. And to question the Emperor was unthinkable. Meanwhile, far from Horus, notice, resentment took root among certain legions. The word-bearers, once devoted to spreading worship of the Emperor, had been publicly humiliated for their faith. Their home city was razed as a lesson. Faith was declared poison. Obedience replaced belief. But belief does not die simply because it is forbidden. It waits. It reshapes itself. It listens. Erebus listened. Where others saw the Emperor's silence as wisdom, Erebus saw abandonment. Where Horus saw duty, Erebus saw manipulation. Slowly, patiently, he began to introduce ideas that felt comforting rather than corrupt. That the universe was not empty of gods. That humanity's destiny was being stolen. That the Emperor had lied, not out of malice but out of fear. At the same time, the Emperor remained distant. He did not explain his plans. He did not reassure his sons. He did not return. Terra became a sealed mystery, and the Golden Throne a symbol of secrets rather than unity. The Primarchs were left to govern themselves, and like all beings forged for war, they began to compete, to judge, and to resent. This is how the Imperium truly began to fracture, not through rebellion, but through silence. By the time the Warmaster would finally bleed on the soil of Davin, the galaxy was already leaning toward disaster. Trust had eroded. Faith had found new shapes. Loyalty had become conditional. The heresy was no longer a possibility. It was a direction. And as the Imperium marched forward, convinced it was building a future of endless light, it failed to see the long shadow stretching behind it, growing darker with every victory. As the Great Crusade pushed deeper into the galaxy, the Imperium of Man began to encounter versions of humanity that no longer resembled the one born on Terra. These were not lost children waiting to be rescued. They were civilizations shaped by isolation, by alien influence, by desperation, and by time. Some had adapted, some had evolved, and some had embraced beliefs that the Imperium declared unacceptable the moment they were discovered. To the Imperium, there was only one correct future for humanity, and it had already been written. Compliance was the word used to soften what followed. Worlds were given a choice that was never truly a choice at all. Accept the Emperor's truth, dismantle your cultures, surrender your autonomy, and pledge absolute loyalty to Terra, or be destroyed. Many complied without resistance, exhausted by centuries of fear and eager for protection. Others resisted, believing their independence worth any cost. Their names were remembered only long enough to be crossed from imperial records. This was how the Imperium learned to forget. The Space Marine legions became instruments not just of war, but of ideology. They did not merely conquer worlds, they reshaped them. Laws were rewritten, faiths were outlawed, histories were corrected. And wherever resistance lingered, it was met with overwhelming force. Entire populations vanished beneath orbital bombardment, their existence reduced to a footnote labeled non-compliant. To most within the Imperium, this was necessary. Harsh, but essential. Humanity had nearly gone extinct once already. There could be no second chance. Unity demanded sacrifice, and sacrifice demanded obedience. But among the Primarchs, reactions differed. Some embraced the Crusade without hesitation. To them, conquest was clarity. Others questioned it privately, wrestling with doubts they never voiced aloud. A few began to wonder whether the Imperium was saving humanity, or simply replacing one tyranny with another. These doubts were dangerous, not because they were wrong, but because they had nowhere to go. The Emperor was absent. Discussion was discouraged. Certainty was rewarded, and so the doubts stayed quiet. Horus, still Warmaster, felt the strain more than most. Every victory brought applause, yet every decision weighed heavier than the last. He was no longer simply winning wars, he was deciding the fate of entire civilizations. And the further the crusade went on, the more he noticed how often the answer was annihilation. The Emperor's truth insisted that gods did not exist. That faith was a weakness exploited by superstition and fear. Yet everywhere the Imperium went, it inspired worship. Citizens knelt before the Primarchs. Shrines were raised in secret. Stories spread faster than compliance orders ever could. Humanity, it seemed, needed something greater than itself to believe in. And the Imperium refused to acknowledge that need. This refusal created a vacuum. And in vacuums, something always answers. Within the Word-Bearer's legion, that answer had already begun to take shape. Once the most devoted of all legions, they had believed utterly in the Emperor's divinity. They built monuments. They spread worship. They believed they were serving humanity by giving it something sacred to hold on to. When the Emperor punished them for this devotion, he did not explain. He simply destroyed what they loved and demanded obedience in return. For the Word-Bearers, obedience was not enough. While the Imperium marched forward in the open, declaring truth through force, something else began to move beneath the surface. Ideas passed quietly between warriors. Questions were asked in private chambers. Ancient symbols resurfaced, stripped of their old meanings and given new ones. Faith did not vanish, it adapted. Meanwhile, the Primarchs continued to drift apart. Without the Emperor to anchor them, rivalries intensified. Old wounds festered. Some felt overlooked. Others felt unappreciated. A few believed they alone truly understood what the Imperium should become. The unity of the Great Crusade remained intact, but only on the surface. Beneath it, fractures spread. The Imperium had become vast, powerful, and unquestioned. And in that unquestioned certainty, it had lost the ability to see itself clearly. It no longer asked whether it was right, only whether it was strong enough to enforce its will. This was the moment before the fall truly began. Not with betrayal, not with war, but with the quiet, dangerous belief that the Imperium's way was the only way, and that anything standing outside it deserved to be erased. There are turning points in history that announce themselves with fire and noise, moments so violent they cannot be misunderstood. And then there are others, quiet, intimate, almost gentle, where a single decision alters the fate of everything that follows. The road to the Horus Heresy passed through one such moment, far from Terra, on a forgotten world called Davin. By the time the Warmaster's fleet reached that system, Horus Lupercal was already carrying a weight few could see. The Great Crusade had stretched on for decades. Victories blurred together. Losses accumulated in silence. The Emperor's absence had become routine, and yet no explanation ever arrived. Horus told himself that this was simply the cost of command. That doubt was weakness. That loyalty meant obedience, even when understanding was withheld. Then came the blade. During a campaign meant to suppress a minor rebellion, Horus was struck by a weapon unlike any other. It was not forged to kill the body alone. It was designed to wound the soul. The Warmaster fell, his life bleeding away despite the finest medical arts the Imperium could offer. For the first time since the Great Crusade began, the Imperium faced the unthinkable possibility that its greatest champion might die. Panic spread through the ranks. Horus was more than a commander. He was a symbol. His death would fracture morale, invite rebellion, and shake the Imperium's image of invincibility. His sons, desperate and afraid, searched for any solution, no matter how forbidden. When the Serpent Lodge of Davin offered a way to save him, they listened. It was framed as ritual, as ancient knowledge, as a means of preservation, not corruption. The choice was never presented as a betrayal. It was presented as love. And love can justify almost anything. As Horus lay dying, his consciousness was drawn into visions, crafted carefully, patiently. He was shown a future where the Imperium worshipped the Emperor as a god, where his brothers were forgotten, where his own name was cursed as that of a traitor. He saw humanity crushed beneath an empire of endless war, ruled by fear and superstition. And standing at the center of it all was the Emperor, silent and unmoving, enthroned as a divine tyrant. The visions were not lies. They were possibilities. Truth woven with manipulation is the most dangerous weapon of all. Horus woke changed, not consumed by rage, not driven mad, but filled with certainty. A calm, steady conviction that something had gone terribly wrong, and that only he could set it right. He did not believe he was betraying the Imperium. He believed he was saving it. Saving humanity from a future of stagnation, worship, and decay. From that moment on, every memory he held of the Emperor was re-examined. Every silence became evidence. Every unanswered question became proof. The Emperor had withheld truth. He had abandoned his sons. He had used them as tools while preparing to ascend beyond them all. At least, that was how it now seemed. Around Horus, those who had long waited for such a moment stepped forward. Voices that had once whispered now spoke openly. Resentments found purpose. Faith found direction. What had begun as doubt hardened into resolve. Loyalty, once absolute, became conditional upon interpretation. The Warmaster began to plan. He did not rush. He did not declare rebellion. He continued the Great Crusade as before, earning trust, projecting stability. To the Imperium, nothing had changed. To Horus, everything had. He began to measure which of his brothers would follow him, and which would stand in his way. He weighed conviction against weakness, pride against loyalty. War was no longer a possibility. It was a necessity. And so the galaxy continued to turn, unaware that its greatest protector had already chosen a different future. One shaped not by hatred, but by a belief that the Imperium itself had become the enemy. The Horus Heresy had begun, not with open war, but with a wounded son who believed, with all his heart, that he was doing the right thing. After Davin, the galaxy did not change overnight. There were no alarms sounded across the Imperium, no declarations of rebellion broadcast to the stars. The Great Crusade continued as it always had, fleets moving from system to system, compliance orders issued and enforced. Not all at once, not openly. Horus knew each Primarch intimately, their strengths, their pride, their grievances. Some felt marginalized by the Emperor's absence. Others resented how their legions had been used or judged. A few already believed the Imperium had lost its way. Horus did not demand loyalty. He offered understanding. He spoke of unity, of truth withheld, of a future where the Primarchs would no longer be tools, but rulers of a humanity freed from deception. Some listened, some hesitated, some refused, and those who refused were remembered. The first blood spilled in this hidden war was not between traitor and loyalist fleets, but between space marines who had once fought side by side. On Istvan III, Horus enacted a purge designed to remove those within his own ranks who would never turn. Loyalist elements of his legion, and others, were deployed under the pretense of suppressing rebellion. What awaited them was not resistance, but annihilation. Virus bombs fell from orbit, reducing cities to choking ruin. Firestorms consumed the surface. Men who had sworn their lives to the Imperium died without ever knowing why. Those who survived the bombardment faced something even worse, the realization that they had been betrayed by their own brothers. It was here, in the ashes of Istvan III, that the Horus Heresy truly revealed itself. The galaxy did not yet know it was at war. But brother had killed brother, and there could be no return from that. The line had been crossed, not with grand speeches or banners of rebellion, but with quiet efficiency. Horus did not rage against the Imperium. He cut away what he believed was weakness. Even then, many of the traitors told themselves this was necessary. That loyalty to Horus was loyalty to humanity's future. That sacrifice, no matter how horrific, was justified by what awaited on the other side of victory. The Imperium would never agree. So it would be remade by force. Word of the betrayal spread slowly, distorted by distance and warp storms. When loyalist forces finally realized what had happened, disbelief came first. Denial followed. The idea that entire legions had turned against the Emperor was unthinkable. The Primarchs were designed to be incorruptible. The War Master was chosen because he could never betray. Reality proved otherwise. As news reached Terra, the Emperor's long silence finally ended, not with words, but with preparation. Defenses were raised. Fleets were recalled. The truth, once hidden, could no longer be contained. The Imperium fractured along the fault lines that had been forming for years. From that moment on, the Great Crusade was over. In its place rose a war without honor, without certainty, and without end. A war where victory meant survival rather than triumph. A war born not from alien invasion, but from the quiet certainty that someone, somewhere, had to be wrong. And so the galaxy burned, not all at once, but slowly, deliberately, as trust collapsed under the weight of betrayal. When the full scale of Horus betrayal emerged, the Imperium did not respond with clarity or unity. It responded with shock. For centuries, humanity had been taught that the Imperium was eternal, that the Emperor's will was absolute, and that his sons were beyond corruption. The revelation that half of the Primarchs and their legions had turned shattered that belief overnight. Panic spread faster than any fleet could travel. Worlds that had sworn loyalty to Terra now questioned which banners truly represented the Imperium. Governors hesitated. Systems fell silent. Warp storms erupted across key routes, isolating entire sectors from one another. The Imperium, once a single unstoppable force, fragmented into isolated pockets of resistance, each unsure whether help would ever arrive. For Horus, this chaos was not an obstacle. It was the point. The War Master moved quickly now, his restraint discarded. Traitor legions surged across the galaxy, striking supply lines, crippling communications, and targeting worlds whose fall would ripple outward in terror. The war was no longer hidden. It was declared through fire. Where Horus passed, the Imperium's authority collapsed, replaced by fear and confusion. Yet this was not a war of clean lines or simple allegiances. Some Primarchs found themselves cut off from Terra, forced to fight alone, unaware of how much of the Imperium had already fallen. Others learned the truth only to find themselves surrounded by traitor forces. Loyalist legions were ambushed, betrayed by allies they had trusted for decades. Entire fleets vanished into the warp, never to return. The galaxy itself seemed to rebel. In the absence of certainty, darker powers grew bolder. The warp, long held at bay through discipline and denial, surged with unnatural intensity. Whispers became screams. Nightmares bled into waking reality. For the first time, many within the Imperium began to suspect that the Emperor's truth had not eliminated gods at all, it had merely refused to name them. On world after world, the war took on a new character. It was no longer only about control, but about belief. Traitor forces promised liberation from imperial tyranny. Loyalists promised survival through obedience. Civilians were crushed between ideologies they had never chosen, their lives reduced to collateral in a war of cosmic ambition. Meanwhile, Horus himself began to change. The certainty that had once steadied him began to demand more. The powers he had accepted to save humanity now whispered of greater sacrifices. His brothers, once equals, became tools or obstacles. The line between leadership and domination blurred, then vanished entirely. The War Master who had once inspired loyalty through compassion now ruled through inevitability. And still, he believed he was right. On Terra, the Emperor prepared for a war he had always known might come, yet still hoped to avoid. The palace became a fortress. Humanity's last great defenses were raised in silence. No grand speech was given. No explanation offered. The Emperor did not justify himself to the galaxy. He simply waited. Because this war could no longer be won through words. The Horus Heresy had escaped containment. It was no longer a rebellion that could be crushed swiftly. It was a civil war that would consume everything it touched. Every victory deepened the tragedy. Every defeat hardened resolve. There would be no return to the world that existed before Davin, before Istvan, before betrayal became history. The galaxy had crossed a threshold. From this point forward, there would be no innocence left to lose, only ground to surrender, lives to spend, and hope to ration carefully. The war had become inevitable, and its end, whatever form it took, would reshape humanity forever. And somewhere in the endless void, fleets turned toward Terra, carrying with them the final question the Imperium would ever face: could it survive the truth of what it had become? As the Horus Heresy spread across the stars, it shed any illusion of purpose or righteousness. What had begun as a rebellion framed around truth and liberation dissolved into something far more brutal. This was no longer a conflict to determine the future of humanity. It was a struggle to decide who would be left alive to witness it. The galaxy fractured into countless, isolated wars. In the vastness of space, loyalist and traitor forces clashed without warning, sometimes without even knowing who truly stood on which side. Old alliances collapsed in moments. Trust became a liability. Space Marines who had once fought together against alien empires now faced one another with grim resignation, recognizing familiar armor just before opening fire. There were no clean victories anymore, only losses measured in scale. On countless worlds, civilians paid the highest price. Planets that had never known rebellion were reduced to ash simply because they lay in the path of advancing fleets. Hive cities burned for weeks. Oceans boiled under orbital bombardment. Entire populations vanished without ceremony, their deaths unrecorded except as strategic necessities. Humanity was no longer being saved. It was being spent. Even among the Primarchs, the cost of the war began to show. Some fought with unwavering loyalty, driven by duty alone. Others fought out of bitterness, convinced that the Imperium deserved to be torn apart for its hypocrisy. Brother faced brother not with fury, but with weary resolve. These were not battles of hatred. They were executions of fate, long delayed, now unavoidable. The ruinous powers, once subtle manipulators, grew bolder as the war dragged on. The veil between reality and the warp thinned, and with it came madness, mutation, and corruption. What had been promised as freedom revealed itself as enslavement of a different kind. Traitor legions found themselves changed, their humanity slowly stripped away in exchange for power they could no longer control. Horus himself felt this transformation more than any other. Each victory required greater sacrifice. Each alliance demanded deeper compromise. The War Masters will remained iron, but it was no longer entirely his own. The powers that had once whispered now commanded. What Horus had believed to be a means to an end had become an end in itself. He could no longer stop. To hesitate now would mean admitting that everything, the betrayal, the slaughter, the burning of worlds, had been for nothing. And so he pressed on. For the Loyalists, hope became something quieter. No longer the certainty of victory, but the stubborn refusal to surrender. Messages from Terra were rare. Reinforcements uncertain. Yet they fought anyway, holding lines that could not truly be defended, buying time they did not know how to use. This was a war of endurance. The Imperium's greatest strength, its scale, became its greatest weakness. With worlds cut off by warp storms and fleets scattered, coordination collapsed. Commanders acted on outdated orders. Sacrifices were made for objectives that no longer mattered. The dream of unity faded, replaced by a grim determination to deny the enemy complete annihilation. Everywhere, the same truth emerged. No matter who won, the Imperium that had existed before the heresy was already dead. The war ground onward, relentless and exhausting, until at last all paths began to converge toward a single destination. Terra, the throne world, the symbolic heart of humanity's empire. Whoever held it would define what the Imperium would become, or whether it would exist at all. The final act was approaching. And by the time the fleets turned toward the Sol system, the question was no longer whether humanity could be saved, but whether anything of it remained worth saving. As the Horus Heresy entered its final phase, the galaxy seemed to narrow. Countless battles still raged across distant systems, but their outcomes no longer mattered in the way they once had. Victory and defeat blurred together, because everyone, traitor and loyalist alike, understood the same truth. This war would not be decided on 1,000 worlds. It would be decided at one. Terra. The throne world was more than a planet. It was the symbol upon which the Imperium had been built. The birthplace of the Emperor's vision. The heart of humanity's power. If Terra fell, the Imperium would become something unrecognizable, or cease to exist entirely. Horus knew this. The Emperor knew this. And so, inevitably, everything began to move in that direction. The path to Terra was not clear. Warp storms still raged, severing routes and swallowing fleets whole. Time itself became unreliable, stretching and collapsing without warning. Some forces arrived too late. Others arrived too early. Many never arrived at all. The galaxy did not simply resist the coming confrontation, it seemed to fracture under the strain of it. For Horus, the journey was one of consolidation. The traitor legions, once divided by pride and ideology, were drawn together by necessity. Old rivalries were set aside, not because they had been resolved, but because there was no room left for them. Horus demanded unity, and the powers behind him enforced it. Those who hesitated were discarded. Those who questioned were silenced. The Warmaster no longer persuaded. He commanded, and they followed. As the traitor armada advanced, systems fell in rapid succession. Defensive lines collapsed under overwhelming force. Loyalist fleets fought desperately to delay the inevitable, sacrificing themselves to buy days, hours, even minutes. These were not victories. They were acts of defiance against extinction. Each stand was made with the knowledge that it would likely be the last. On Terra, preparation replaced hope. The Emperor remained silent, seated upon the golden throne, directing defenses with cold precision. The imperial palace was transformed into the most heavily fortified structure humanity had ever created. Walls rose like mountain ranges. Weapons capable of shattering fleets were positioned in silence. Millions of soldiers were gathered, knowing that most would never leave the planet again. There were no speeches promising glory. Only orders. Those defending Terra understood that this was not a battle meant to be won cleanly. It was a battle meant to be survived long enough for something, anything, to break the enemy's momentum. Every corridor, every gate, every defensive line was designed to extract a price in blood. Humanity would not surrender its birthplace willingly. The solar system itself became a battlefield. As Horus forces entered the outer reaches, space erupted into chaos. Fleets clashed in engagements so vast they defied comprehension. Ships burned for days before finally breaking apart. Debris fields formed where armadas once stood. The void filled with the echoes of weapons fire and dying transmissions, overlapping into a constant, distant roar. This was the Solar War. Each engagement pushed closer to Terra, stripping away defenses layer by layer. Loyalist commanders made impossible choices, abandoning positions to preserve what little strength remained. Every retreat felt like failure. Every stand felt like a death sentence. Yet they fought on, driven not by optimism, but by obligation. For Horus, there was no longer any turning back. The closer he came to Terra, the heavier the weight upon him grew. The powers he had embraced demanded completion. Victory was no longer enough. The Emperor had to fall. Not simply defeated, but broken. The old order had to end completely, or the sacrifices made along the way would be meaningless. As the traitor fleets finally breached the inner system, the outcome of the heresy began to feel inevitable. Terra stood ahead, battered but unyielding. Horus stood at the head of an army that no longer resembled the one that had once set out to reunite humanity. The final confrontation was no longer a question of if, only how much would be left when it was over. The Siege of Terra was not a battle. It was an apocalypse measured in months, in millions of lives, in the slow, inevitable crumbling of humanity's greatest city. The planet groaned under. Bombardment. The heavens themselves seemed to resist the onslaught, warp storms twisting stars into unnatural light, bending time and space as if the universe itself recoiled from what was happening. Horus' fleet struck first, not with fury alone, but with precision born of decades of experience. Every loyalist force they encountered was crushed or driven back. Every planetary defense torn apart. The galaxy had never seen an assault so meticulous, so relentless. And all of it led to the walls of the Imperial Palace. Inside those walls, the Emperor prepared. The War Master's arrival was no surprise, he had anticipated every move. Yet anticipation did not lessen the weight of what was to come. Every decision, every strategy, every life on Terra was a burden he bore silently. Unlike Horus, the Emperor's mind was not clouded by ambition. His purpose was singular: to end the rebellion without destroying the empire he had built, if it were still possible. For the defenders, the siege was hell incarnate. Loyalist legions fought street by street, corridor by corridor. Generals made impossible choices, sacrificing thousands to save tens of thousands. Civilians were evacuated when possible, but many remained, trapped beneath the crushing weight of war. The Imperium's once proud armies now resembled a desperate bulwark, holding back an unstoppable tide with nothing but courage, skill, and sheer stubbornness. The war had become personal. Horus himself did not revel in destruction. He did not laugh at the suffering of those beneath his fleet. Every moment, every decision, was made with the conviction that he was correcting an error older than himself. Humanity had been misled. The Emperor had abandoned them. And yet, every blow struck against loyalists, every city reduced to rubble, carried a shadow of doubt. Did this truly serve a greater purpose, or had the war consumed him as much as it had the galaxy? Finally, the inevitable arrived. Horus and the Emperor confronted one another aboard the War Master's flagship, the Vengeful Spirit. The corridors of the vessel seemed impossibly long, echoing with the silent weight of a universe watching. The confrontation was not immediate violence, but a collision of will, belief, and history. Words were exchanged, truths, half-truths, accusations, and regrets, but even as they spoke, the warp surged around them, amplifying power beyond mortal comprehension. The duel that followed was cataclysmic. Every strike shattered walls, every blast reshaped corridors. The War Master's strength was amplified by the powers he had embraced, while the Emperor's resolve carried the weight of centuries of planning, wisdom, and sacrifice. Neither was merely fighting for themselves. Each was fighting for humanity, for the Imperium, for the culmination of all that had come before. And yet, the difference between them was stark. Horus fought for conviction, the Emperor for survival. When the final moment came, it was both swift and inevitable. Horus, exhausted, corrupted, and consumed by the very forces he had used, faltered. The Emperor, with a mixture of rage, sorrow, and cold necessity, struck him down. The War Master fell, and with him, the last hope for an Imperium remade in rebellion. Yet victory was hollow. The Emperor was gravely wounded. He did not emerge from the battle triumphant in the way that history would one day claim. He was entombed within the Golden Throne, a life suspended between existence and oblivion. Humanity was saved from immediate destruction, but at a cost that would echo for millennia. The Imperium endured, but it was forever scarred. Its ruler was a living corpse, its empire ruled by fear as much as by law. The galaxy would never be the same. And the heresy, though ended in victory, had sown seeds. That could not be undone. Loyalty had been tested to its breaking point. Faith had been shattered and reshaped. Brother had killed brother. And the universe had glimpsed the fragility of everything it had believed immutable. The Siege of Terra marked the end of one age and the beginning of another. One where the Imperium survived, but at a cost that none could fully comprehend. Where heroes were haunted by what they had endured. And where the shadow of the Horus Heresy would linger, ever present, in the conscience of every soldier, every commander, every human who remained. The story of the galaxy's greatest betrayal had reached its climax, leaving behind a silence heavy with loss, triumph, and the knowledge that even victory can feel like defeat. The dust of the Horus Heresy settled slowly, unevenly, across the stars. Worlds once vibrant lay in ruins. Civilizations had been extinguished, reshaped, or left broken, their histories rewritten by fire and betrayal.